One of the themes that has come up fairly regularly in our talks in this conference has had to do with the extraordinary philological competence of the 47 translators who worked on the King James Version of the Bible. These were men of remarkable scholarship, not only in Hebrew and Greek as necessary, but in a great range of ancient Near Eastern languages contextually around the primary languages to be translated, which include, of course, Aramaic and Syriac and Coptic and many other kinds of languages, including Persian. It reminds me that this is indeed how the great translation of Jerome, the Vulgate, was also accomplished, but in his case by one extraordinary polyglot scholar. And I say this partly because it pertains to our speaker tonight in a very direct way, and it is in this respect as well as others that I would honor him and encourage you who are students and who are interested in these things to see him as an exemplar of some of the things that will make for great scholarship in his field, in the field that some of you aspire to. Robert Alter is a class of 1937 professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley. He has been there since 1967. You can count that. Before that, he was at Columbia. He was a student of the legendary Harry Levin at Yale as a graduate student. And what he brings to bear on his scholarship over the entire range of his career is the sort of thing which is very rare today. He has the philological aptitude and intelligence of a Leo Spitzer. He has the literary sense and the great instinct for style that one associates with Erich Auerbach in his Mimesis. And so his work not only has been in comparative literature of the European languages, he's especially expert in French, but he's turned his attention, starting in the 80s, in the early 80s, to the Hebrew Bible. And for many of us, this is where we really began to pay attention to the work of Robert Alter. His two prize-winning books, his early books, The Art of Biblical Narrative and The Art of Biblical Poetry, I see several students trucking those about with them and trying to get signed here. They are still standard in the field in the study of the literary character of the Hebrew Bible. But he didn't stop there. He undertook to do what really only St. Jerome might try, I think. He undertook to do his own translation of the Hebrew Bible. He began with Genesis and eventually did the Pentateuch. He's done the Psalms, he's done the wisdom books. Wisdom books, for those of you who don't do Hebrew, it's some of the most elegant and beautiful and also most difficult Hebrew to translate. I've looked at these works that he has done, and I have found them a source of great admiration, and I congratulate you on the achievement in those books. They're really remarkable. His career takes him back now to American literature, to the modern period. And recently he has written a book called Pen of Iron, American Prose in the King James Bible. That came out earlier this year from Princeton University Press. I've seen a few copies of that around as well. His topic tonight is of great interest to those who have an appreciation for the special character of the King James Bible as it falls upon the ear when it is read well. The question of eloquence in the King James Version. Will you help me welcome Robert Alter?
Well, thank you for that very generous welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to see face-to-face two people whom I've had extremely friendly and helpful email exchanges, David Jeffries and Francis Malone. As for St. Jerome, I want to assure everyone in this room I am no saint, but I am translating as a single person and not as a committee. Now, I'd like to just say a word before I begin about what I think is the special double perspective I'm going to bring in these remarks on the King James Version. Unlike almost everybody else among the presenters at the conference. A literary critic, and a literary critic of a sort that is becoming something of a dinosaur these days. That is somebody who's been, throughout his career, deeply interested in the analysis of style. And you will hear that coming through in my remarks. At the same time, I am someone who, since adolescence, has had a very intimate relationship with the Hebrew Bible in the Hebrew, which eventually led me to Bible translation. And some of the judgments I'm going to make, I think you'll be able to hear this, have to do with looking at a particular Hebrew text alongside the King James Committee and saying, hey, they made a really good decision, or I wonder if they called this one right. So you'll hear that as well. If there is a single attribute large numbers of readers attach almost reflexively to the King James Version, it would most likely be eloquence. The warrant for this attribution is abundantly evident. Eloquence, a term often associated with oratory, perhaps especially delivered orally, suggests a powerful marshaling of the resources of language to produce a persuasive effect. And that quality is manifested in verse after verse of the 1611 translation. And here, I'd like to say parenthetically that this, of course, is not the only available thumbnail definition of eloquence. And the literary critic Dennis Donahue, who's a very smart man, fairly recently published a book called On Eloquence, in which he talks about eloquence as the sense that language liberates itself from its merely communicative purpose and becomes something like song. The problem with that is that then every kind of use of language which excites you or that you like, you can call eloquence. So he discusses Madame Bovary as an instance of eloquence. I think that Flaubert's prose is beautiful, it's nuanced, it's precise. But if you want a model of eloquence, you don't go to Flaubert, you go to Lincoln's second inaugural address. So, and it's that kind of effect that one finds again and again in the King James Version. It is an intrinsic quality of this English rendering of the Bible that no doubt has been heightened by the virtually canonical status of the King James Bible as it came to enjoy it, and by the performance of passages from it in ecclesiastical settings or on other solemn occasions. If it became almost a convention in Hollywood films of the 1930s and 40s to introduce a sonorous recitation of the 23rd Psalm in deathbed scenes, this biblical illumination of the cinematic moment was surely felt to be appropriate because the beautifully cadenced language of the King James Version that psalm is such a moving expression of trust in God, even in life's darkest moments. The eloquence of the 1611 translation nevertheless deserves some scrutiny in regard to its sources, its nature, its relation to the original language of the Bible, and to the degree to which it may or may not be pervasive in these English renderings of the biblical text. Let me propose at the outset that the eloquence of the narrative prose and the eloquence of the poetry are not cut from the same cloth. However much readers tend to lump them together, something they may be encouraged to do by the fact that the King James Bible provides no typographical differentiation between poetry and prose. For the prose, the committee convened, I should use the plural, the committees convened by King James adopted a translation strategy adumbrated by Tyndale a century earlier, meant to create close equivalents for the Hebrew diction and syntax, and that resulted in a particular kind of forceful effect, which I think was new in English. An exemplary instance is the beginning of the report of the flood in Genesis 7:17 through 21, and I will read that. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up upon the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. And all flesh, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. It should be said that the flood story, though it shares certain features with other kinds of narrative prose in the Bible, is not entirely typical, because in its solemnity and in its rhythmically choreographed account of portentous primeval events, both in the passages drawn from the J and even more from the P document, it produces a kind of epic grandeur. That, of course, is precisely an occasion for the exhibition of eloquence, which is finally exploited by the 1611 translators. The parallel syntax of the Hebrew, elsewhere deployed for other purposes, here is used to present a stately parade of clauses linked by and that report the sequence of momentous acts in which the whole earth is covered with the waters of the flood. Laying everything out in these parallel structures is not, I think, a natural way to package syntax in English, though it became a viable option for literary English after the King James Version. The King James translators, by following the syntactic contours of the Hebrew, achieved a new kind of compelling effect, at once lofty and almost stark. The antithetical strategy of modern translators of the Bible by sundry scholarly ecclesiastical committees has been to repackage the syntax of the original in order to convey a sense that it might have been written in the 20th century. What is lost in eloquence is palpable, and I'll give you an illustration in a moment. Compare, for example, again from the King James Version. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. So you hear the and. With the rendering of the Revised English Bible, I quote, "The ark floated on the surface of the swollen waters as they increased over the earth." The modern version is clear, the pursuit of perfect clarity being, in my view, one of the great fallacies of modern translators of the Bible. And it has a certain succinct tidiness, but it loses all the high solemnity of the King James Version. Instead of the report of three actions in grand sequence conveyed by three verbs, the prevailing and the increasing of the waters and the movement of the ark over the waters, the prevailing of the flood is tucked into an adjective, swollen, that is swollen waters, and the increase of the waters is relegated to a subordinate clause, with the movement of the ark now, quote, logically placed at the beginning of the sentence. That is, the ark floated on the surface of the swollen waters as they increased over the earth. So you see what I mean by repackaging. This is not operative, right? An epic movement in some has been reduced to prosaic notation. Beyond considerations of syntax, much of the force of the 1611 translation derives from the kind of diction to which it generally adheres, at least in the narrative prose. There is a good deal of evidence that the writers of ancient Hebrew narrative, by a tacit consensus of literary convention, used a deliberately restricted vocabulary. That is one way you can tell this, is that there's a much bigger vocabulary with many more synonyms in the prose. Synonymity, which is often rich and inventive in biblical poetry, was rigorously avoided in the prose, and a lexicon of primary terms rather than fancy literary ones was generally favored. By and large, the King James translators honor this ancient commitment to plain diction and to the repetition of terms. Note in our passage how, quote, the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and how the ark went upon the face of the waters. The taught, that is T-A-U-T, eloquence of the narrative inheres partly in the use faithful to the original of such simple primary terms. Here, the verbs to be and to go, that is, went upon the face of the waters, the flood was 40 days. Alas, modern translators, evidently feeling this is not the way they would have written the story, have not been able to resist the temptation of improving the original. Thus, as we have seen in the Revised English Bible, the ark is made to float, not go upon the waters. And in a still more fanciful exercise of editorial license, the New Jewish Publication Society translation has the ark drift. Are we certain that Noah's craft was rudderless? Other word choices in the 1611 version work equally well, even if one might have marginal reservations about a few of them. For the most part, as is evident here, a homespun Anglo-Saxon vernacular is favored that is a good English equivalent of the plain diction of the Hebrew. Elsewhere, the use of such polysyllabic Latinate terms as iniquity, tribulation, countenance, and habitation might be questioned, though all those words by now bear the authoritative weight of the canonical. In our passage, prevailed, remember the waters prevailed, is an interesting, if slightly odd choice, probably dictated by the fact that this same Hebrew verb is used elsewhere for prevailing in battle, though the local sense seems to be something like surged. Another reiterated verb here, increased, is fair enough as a rendering of the Hebrew, and idiomatically right in context, though a small opportunity is missed in not using multiplied, the English equivalent for this Hebrew verb that is employed in the creation story. For there is a pointed irony that the same activity of multiplication initially applied to human procreation is now attached to the destruction of all living things. The King James translators, of course, had no notion of reiterated thematic key words as a formal literary device in biblical narrative, and so their choices sometimes reproduce the device and sometimes, as here, obscure it. In any case, their language, in this case as in so many other instances, does capture a great deal of the evocative driving force of the original. Throughout the translation of the Bible's narrative prose, the emulation in English of the Hebrew's plain diction and parallel syntax conveys the paradoxical sense of a discourse at once plain and elevated. And I just want to add a word of explanation here, since I invoked a particular literary technique, the repetition of a thematic key word, and I'll be talking a little bit about literary structure in the poetry. Some of you may ask, since there's been a lot of theology floated around the last few days, well, if the Bible is the revealed Word of God, what does literary form have to do with it? Well, why do you have to know about narrative techniques, or why do you have to know about poetic structure? The fact of the matter is, especially for the Hebrew Bible, that the vast majority of the texts are cast either as very artful narrative prose or as poetry, a poetry which often rises to a very high degree of artistry. So what you have to say is that these writers, God-inspired as they felt themselves to be, chose to cast their radically new vision, the monotheistic vision, in artful prose narrative and in beautifully wrought poetry. So it's my contention that if you follow the way that the literary art works, you get a finer sense of the religious vision, and this is true with translations as well. Now let me get on to poetry. The case of poetry is more complicated. Biblical poetry uses a noticeably richer vocabulary than does the narrative prose, and at least some of it appears to be specialized poetic vocabulary, sometimes incorporating archaic terms and archaic grammatical forms. Because semantic parallelism, that's parallelism in meaning, between the two, in some instances, three parts of the poetic line is fundamental to the system, the poets played with many different possibilities of synonymity, though it should also be said that usually the ostensible echoing of the first half of the line in the second half involves some sort of heightening, intensification, or even narrative development. The structure of biblical Hebrew, in which subjects, objects, and pronominal reference can all be packed into a single word through prefixes, suffixes, or conjugated forms, lends itself to a terrific compactness. That is, even "the Lord is my shepherd" is 2 words in the Hebrew. A feature repeatedly exploited rhythmically and otherwise by the poets. The compactness is a special challenge for translators because the structure of English is so radically different, and the King James translators do not appear to have paid much attention to the conciseness of the original, focused as they were on the literal meaning of the Hebrew words and not, for the most part, on how they sounded. This did not prevent them from achieving effects of great eloquence in rendering the poetry, but it was often not a Hebrew eloquence, as I shall try to show. The one bit of poetry from the King James Version that most native speakers of English know by heart, probably everybody in this room, is this line from the 23rd Psalm. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." It is certainly eloquent, but is the eloquence biblical? I would argue that it is not. that is not original biblical. The difference being between a wonderfully expansive utterance and a powerfully succinct one. The English deploys 17 words and 20 syllables. That ratio, by the way, neatly reflects the degree to which the translation on the whole aptly chooses short, simple words. The Hebrew here shows just 8 words, 11 syllables, and sounds something like this. Ach ki elech begei tzalmavet lo ira ra. The English makes evocative use of a string of 3 noun phrases, through the valley of the shadow of death, which has the effect of spinning out the skein of the beleaguered walker's trajectory through the dark valley to the very brink of death. The Hebrew has not a single of, and only one preposition, itself no more than a particle attached to the beginning of the word that means valley. Shadow of death, some scholars, but not I, think it merely means darkness, is a single word, more or less like death shadow, as the Hebrew is talmavet, and valley is joined to it in what amounts to a genitive structure that dispenses with of. That is, you have Gate Salmavet, valley of death without an of. I hope that it wasn't too technical to follow. The English version, though not set as verse, feels like a line of poetry, but it is a kind of free verse poetry that is almost an anticipation of Walt Whitman. One thinks of all those lengthy lines of Whitman's that sweep on grandly across the page from left margin to right, and is surely relevant that Whitman was influenced by the King James Version, and especially by Psalms. This microscopic example tells us something about the general character of the translation of poetry in the King James Version. It often reads magnificently as English verse. One recalls among a host of memorable instances many of the Psalms, the voice from the whirlwind in Job, the haunting poem on mortality at the end of Ecclesiastes. Eloquence seems the proper attribute for these renderings of ancient Hebrew poetry. Yet, as in the line from the 23rd Psalm, the eloquence often is more Jacobean, that is from the age of King James, than biblical, orotund, expansive, at times exhibiting a relish in the accumulation of ringing words and syllables, whereas the Hebrew is compact and incisive. Let me venture a general qualification about the admired eloquence of the 17th century translation. Because the translators were constantly concentrating on the words, straining to work out the most precise English equivalents for each of them, they did not, as I have noted, pay a great deal of attention to the sound of the words, which, as in all poetry, is inseparable from their meaning. Intermittently, intuitively, they do appear to have listened to the sounds, as attested by the fine rendering of the great prose poem that opens the book of Ecclesiastes, where there's good evidence that the translators were picking up the mesmerizing music of the Hebrew. But more often than most readers choose to remember, the translators exhibit an indifference to the cadences and the compactness of the Hebrew, blunting its pointed expressiveness. Because we think automatically of eloquence when we think of the King James Version, we tend to overlook the lapses, the places where the language audibly stumbles. Here are 2 lines of poetry that constitute the 9th verse of Psalm 30. What profit is there in my blood when I go down to the pit? Shall the dust praise thee? Shall it declare thy truth? The compact diction of the Hebrew is admirable throughout these two lines, and the rendering of the second line with its emphatic parallelism, praise thee, declare thy truth, is perfectly apt. Yet something has gone awry rhythmically in the first of these two lines. The Hebrew sounds like this: Ma betza bidami beriditi el shachat. There are exactly 3 words, 3 accented syllables in each half of the line, with a pounding alliteration of M's and B's in the first half. That is ma betza bidami, right? The King James Version could have reproduced the strong rhythm and expression of the speaker's desperate insistence by writing, "What profit in my blood?" which would have actually been an identical cadence to the Hebrew. Okay, full revelation, that's how I translated it. Fearful, however, that they might be obscuring an implied meaning, they felt obliged to add the words, "is there." That is, their translation is, "What profit is there in my blood?" Indicating by the italics that these words are merely implied. In the first edition, as some of you may know, the italics weren't used. That is, the main text was bold-faced Gothic, and then the words that in our printed King James Bibles are italics were Roman font and also smaller font. The consequence is to break the rhythm of the line. In the second half of the line, "when I go down to the pit," is a precise representation of the meaning of the 3 Hebrew words, but the problem with expressive sound has been magnified. It is not merely that we are given 7 words for 3, but that the entire clause is rhythmically slack, the strong cadence poetry of the original devolving into a prose amble. The King James translators are at their best when they hew closely to the evocative simplicity of the Hebrew diction, as is evident in the example from the flood story, or even, despite the problems of rhythm, in the 2 lines from Psalm 30 that we've been considering. These learned churchmen, as David Jeffrey said, some of them were conversant in Arabic, Syriac, and Aramaic, as well as Hebrew and Greek, of course viewed all of Scripture as sacred, and the assumed context of the sacred at times led them astray in their translation choices, either producing a kind of eloquence that is rather unbiblical, or actually compromising the overall effect of eloquence. And let me expand on that before I go on. That of course the Bible is a religious text, but some of its greatness has to do with the fact that it conveys a religious vision in language that is not at all ecclesiastical and usually not theological. It's a kind of language that you can put your fingers on, language of the everyday, and they don't always honor that. So let me give you a couple of examples. Memorably, at the beginning of the creation story, the King James translators have God place a firmament between the waters above and the waters below. Firmament is a medieval astronomical term. Chaucer uses it, and it in fact has a certain etymological warrant, because the Hebrew rakia, conceived by the ancients as a vast celestial slab dividing the heavens from the waters above from the waters below, derives from a verb that means to pound out, though I'm not entirely sure the King James translators were aware of that etymology when they use firmament. But it is something of a mouthful as an English word for sky, and qualifies as what the Elizabethans called an inkhorn term, thus introducing an element of erudite fussiness of which there is no hint in the original. That element is even more evident when the word is used in poetry, as at the beginning of Psalm 19. I quote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." One might justifiably claim that this line of English poetry has real grandeur, but the presence of firmament, where the Hebrew simply says sky, imparts a note of formal elevation not intended by the ancient poet. The reverential view of the Bible often leads the translators to opt for ecclesiastical or theologically fraught terms that give the biblical language a coloration fundamentally alien to it. In the fourth verse of Psalm 19, from which I've just quoted, it is said of God that in the heavens, quote, "hath he set a tabernacle for the sun." Now, what God sets up in the heavens is actually a tent, the ordinary word for the prosaic dwelling, often made of black goat skins, where Bedouins and migratory pastoralists like Abraham made their dwelling. Tabernacle enters the celestial scene because the translators are thinking ecclesiastically. It might be a nice flourish, but it falsifies the original, where three plain words, in them, which is one word in the Hebrew, set and sun, are matched by the plain word used for the sun's dwelling, ohel, tent. A similar elevation of an ordinary Hebrew dwelling place is observable in Psalm 18, verse 11. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. The first half of this line seems to me just right. That is, he made darkness his secret place. The second half runs into the difficulty of sprawling rhythm. His pavilion round him were dark borders and thick clouds of the skies. So that's the kind of sprawling rhythm we noted before. And there are a couple of unnecessary words which appear in italics in the King James. But more to our present purpose, pavilion is a suspect choice for the Hebrew sukkah, which means a shelter. In some instances, the rough thatched shelter set up by a watchman in a vegetable patch. What the learned divines of the 17th century obviously felt was that for the Lord of hosts in his celestial setting, something grander, something more imperial was called for. And so they gave us pavilion, which adds an impressive clarion note, but is quite unlike the original. In addition to these instances, in which the King James Version introduces alien gestures of elevation, it also imposes an alien theological frame of reference through some of the English terms it uses. And of course, I suppose this is, I don't mean to be condescending about this is inescapable, because they saw the Bible through a particular theological lens, some of it determined by translation choices that go all the way back to my colleague St. Jerome, and they could hardly get away from this, right? That was inevitable because the translators, after all, regarded both testaments as inspired repositories of Christian faith. Let me mention just one recurrent instance. The 1611 translation abounds in the word salvation, especially in Psalms. And some of you may immediately say, well, where do you expect to find salvation if not in the Bible? I think theologically you can find it, but not poetically, as I'll explain. God of my salvation is a wonderfully resonant phrase, and one is loath to give it up. Even I am, though I have rigorously excluded it from my own English version of Psalms. Salvation, we all recognize, is a theologically loaded term, sometimes pointing to a vast eschatological horizon, and sometimes to a dramatic transformation of the condition of the individual soul that will remain in effect for all eternity. In the world of ancient Israel, however, with its unflagging commitment to the here and now, the word Yeshua, which is consistently rendered as salvation in the 1611 version, as well as the verb that is cognate with that noun, Hoshea, plainly suggests getting out of a tight fix, whether in battle or in situations of danger or distress. Thus, the verb in question and the noun mean something like rescue. And however it may grate on canonically tuned ears, the reiterated epithet for God actually means God of my rescue, which I know will shock a few of you. And I should say something about this, about what do you do when you translate the Bible in the 21st century and you have the King James Version behind you? Do you pay attention to it? I think you do, but not always. That is, for example, when I came to Am I my brother's keeper? There are other ways to render the Hebrew, but that's perfectly good, and it's become proverbial in Hebrew. So why mess around with it? So I'll use Am I my brother's keeper. But in the case of God of my salvation, as terrific as it sounds, it isn't quite what the Hebrew means. So I decided to grate those ears and use God of my rescue. The God of my salvation, of course, is a deity who more comfortably dwells in pavilions than in shelters, and who erects a tabernacle, not a tent, in the sky for the sun. All this may sound, especially at this moment of 4th century anniversary celebrations, like ungenerous carping, or maybe knocking the competition. But I want to stress that what I have been saying does not constitute a stylistic critique of the King James Version. The kinds of terms about which I have been raising questions, in fact, often contribute to the general eloquence of this canonical translation. The problem is that in numerous places, by virtue of such momentary elevation of diction, the style becomes grandiloquent, which is fine in its own right, but nothing like the original. It's worth pursuing more broadly what the King James Version does with biblical poetry. Its rendering of the prose narratives, of course, affords many moving moments, but it is above all in the poetry that we feel we are swept up by a grandeur of language that seems strongly distinctive among all the possibilities of literary English. Melville's attunement in Moby Dick to the poetry of the King James Version is deeply instructive in this regard. His aspiration, which his own contemporaries did not fathom, the book was a flop when it came out, was to create an American prose epic that would have the cosmic reach of Paradise Lost and Shakespeare's tragedies and of the Bible itself. And so his language is sometimes high Miltonic, more often, especially at moments of narrative intensity, Shakespearean, and very frequently biblical, all intermingled with a good deal of pungent American vernacular. So there's this wonderful amalgam of different styles in Melville. But unlike other American writers whose style bears the imprint of the King James Bible, Melville was drawn preponderantly to the poetry and not to the prose of Hebrew Scripture. He may not have fully perceived it as poetry, given the prose typography in which the translation presents it, but that would have been very much to his purpose, since he aspired to write poetic prose. What is formally interesting is that just as he internalized the iambic cadences of Shakespeare and Milton, producing many lines of prose that are fully scannable, he also internalized the semantic parallelism that is the foundation of the biblical poetic system, creating many lines built from emphatically parallel clauses that really read like lines of biblical verse. What he sensed in biblical poetry was precisely its eloquence. If the stark and explosive poetry of Lear in the Night Storm on the Moor gave him a lexicon for representing the searing experience of men in an open boat on the tossing ocean in pursuit of a whale, Psalms, Job, and the prophets offered him both a stylistic register for reaching from sky to abyss and a poetic vehicle of hammering insistence in the inter-echoing clauses of the parallelistic verse. Here is an evocation of Ahab's torment, which reads like a lost verse from the book of Job, though there is no actual allusion. I quote, "He sleeps with clenched hands and wakes with his own bloody nails." You hear the two parts of the line, the A and the B of a line of biblical poetry. Again, in describing the vat in which the whale blubber is rendered on the deck of the Pequod, Melville writes, "It smells like the left wing of the day of judgment." It is an argument for the pit. Despite two American colloquial touches here, the left wing and the argument, this is a sentence that scans as a line of biblical poetry with the two parallel clauses, and it would not be out of place in Isaiah. I invoke the instance of Melville because it is always strong testimony to genuine eloquence when it can engender a kindred eloquence in a later writer. The 1611 translation made a difference not only in the subsequent history of English poetry, but also on both sides of the Atlantic, maybe even more on the American side, in the evolution of English prose. The book of Job is the ultimate test of the power and imperfections of any translation because it is the pinnacle of biblical poetry, manifesting a forcefulness, a formal virtuosity, and a vigor of inventive metaphor that make it one of the most brilliant achievements of all ancient Mediterranean poetry. It must be said, people are not necessarily aware of this, that the Hebrew text of Job swarms with difficulties, perhaps at least in part because the ancient scribes, not entirely understanding the rich and sometimes exotic vocabulary they were transcribing, frequently scrambled it. The scribes do this all the time. If they don't understand a word, they mess it up or they substitute a word they know. One should not then fault the King James translators for failing to make sense of many of the crusades of the book. Their modern counterparts have done only somewhat better. But quite apart from any consideration of deciphering or reconstructing corrupted texts, how well did the 1611 translators convey the grandeur and the formal subtlety of the poetry of Job? The broad gauge answer has to be that their own poetic performance was impressively successful, or countless English readers, Melville among them, could scarcely have responded as they did to the strong poetry of Job's anguish or to the grand panorama of creation in the voice from the whirlwind. One must thus begin with a general assumption that the translation of Job is a prime piece of evidence for the splendid and enduring eloquence of the King James Version. Nevertheless, some qualifications are in order. To pull this picture into focus, let us consider what the 17th century translation does with Job's great death wish poem in chapter 3, which opens the whole poetic argument of the book. Here are the first 11 lines of the poem. Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it, let a cloud dwell upon it, let the darkness of the day terrify it. As for the night, let darkness seize upon it, let it not be joined unto the days of the year, let it not come into the number of the months. Lo, let that night be solitary, let no joyful voice come therein. Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning, because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from my eyes. Why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out from the belly? Why did the knees prevent me, or why the breast that I should suck? For now should I have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept, then had I been at rest. Prevent, by the way, in 17th century English means anticipate. Okay. Some, but not all of this, is quite wonderful, amply confirming the reputation for compelling eloquence of the 1611 translation. Among much to admire here, one might single out the way this version captures the driving force of the triadic Hebrew line in verse 5. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of day terrify it. Stain is a particularly fine English choice for a relatively rare Hebrew verb that means to besmirch or to foul. Accuracy in grasping the original is not our consideration, but this passage happens to contain one of the egregious errors of the King James Version, which it may be instructive to note. That is, there are some howlers in the King James Version. This is one of them. The cursors, who in this version are, quote, ready to raise up their mourning, that is mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, whatever that may mean, in fact, are ready to raise Leviathan. The mistake arose because Leviathan, Leviathan, has a homonym that means their mourning. The translators, even without knowing what we do through archaeological discoveries about Leviathan as a fearsome sea monster in Canaanite mythology, might have realized that they had gotten it wrong, because what they construed as a possessive suffix would be a feminine plural, that is, the N sound at the end of Leviathan, whereas the context requires a masculine plural. And to that I will add, if you do philology, you can't help being a pedant, that the word levaya, which does mean mourning or funeral, is not a biblical word, it's rabbinic Hebrew, and they read it back into the Bible. Okay, let me continue. In any event, the result of this mistake, mourning for Leviathan, was to miss the first introduction of the fabulous beast that will play a climactic role at the end of the poem in the speech from the whirlwind. One other error in the passage is the result of uncharacteristic timidity on the part of the 17th century translators. The phrase, "the dawning of the day," in verse 9, did I skip this in my text? I think I did, actually. Let it not see the dawning of the day, the night that I was conceived. So the phrase, "the dawning of the day," in verse 9, should be "the eyelids of the dawn." Faced with a bold and striking metaphor, they apparently were unable to imagine how the dawn could have eyelids. And so they erased the figure entirely, as alas, many modern translators continue to do this. What you find in modern translation is glimmerings of the dawn. But the Hebrew word clearly means eyelids, and it's a terrific metaphor. There's just as the eyelids crack open, you stand on your balcony at 4:30 in the morning looking on the eastern horizon, and you see that first crack of light coming up. I mean, he was an amazing poet, as I said. The canonical English version certainly contains strong poetry, but it is a loose kind of poetry in which the rhythm often goes slack. The beginning of verse 9, I'm curious, my text, I'll check this on the proofs, skipped verse 9. I am very sorry about that. The beginning of oh no, I got to refine my place. My apologies. So the beginning of verse 9. Let it, I can recite this from heart. Let its twilight stars be dark. Let it not see how do they have it? The dawning of the day. That's how they translate it. So so the beginning of that verse, let the stars of the twilight thereof be dark, involves an unnecessary proliferation of syllables and words, even in 17th century usage, to represent 3 Hebrew words, 3 beats. The translators could easily have rendered this as, let its twilight stars be dark, which would have gotten you close to the Hebrew rhythm. The fact that they did not may reflect a fondness for orotundity, a kind of eloquence perhaps more rhetorical than poetic. In the next verse, an awkwardly extraneous word is the consequence of their commitment to absolute literalism. Quote, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb. The Hebrew simply says, my womb. But since Job, we understand, could not have a womb, the obvious meaning is the womb he inhabited for 9 months, which of course was his mother's. This minor difficulty could have been obviated by translating the phrase as the doors of the womb, the instead of my. But because the Hebrew noun shows a first-person possessive suffix, the translators felt obliged to represent it, adding the awkward mothers in italics to indicate it's a word merely implied in the Hebrew. Verse 11 is an example of both the splendid felicity of the 1611 translation and of its lapses into ungainliness. The Hebrew has 4 words in the first half of the line and 3 in the second, with 4 beats against 3. The English rendering of the first half of the line could scarcely be surpassed. Why died I not from the womb? The Hebrew is Lama Merechem Egva. Right? These 7 monosyllabic words with 3 accents perfectly convey the forceful compactness of the Hebrew. As a translator, I envy the freedom of my 17th century predecessors to deploy the rhythmically concise inversion, died I not, where modern usage compels one to settle for did I not die. But in the second half of the line, the translation becomes unhinged. Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? The entire clause is arrhythmic, and it offers a full 16 words for 3 in the Hebrew. This version reflects a certain literalist impulse of clarification, that is why and not, which are not necessary and are italicized or stuck in. And though give up the ghost is a fine old phrase, there are surely more compact English synonyms for dying. It is hard to resist the inference that the King James translators often relish the proliferation of words, a stylistic habit that could generate a kind of eloquence, though not, I think, here, but an eloquence antithetical to the original. It's not been my intention to expose the stylistic beauty of the King James Version as merely a long-standing cultural delusion. The impressive power of the canonical English Bible is surely secure, and it continues both to nourish us as readers and to provide a wealth of resources for English writers. My argument has been rather that we all tend to remember books selectively, just as we remember almost everything selectively. Having been moved by the lofty dignity, the poised cadences, and the plain directness of the King James Version in many passages, we are inclined to imagine in recollection that the entire translation is like that. In point of fact, the grandeur of the 1611 version is not infrequently interrupted by stylistic lapses, awkwardness, and patches of gratuitous wordiness. Job 3:11, which we just looked at, is a microcosmic instance of the ups and the downs of the King James Version. The first half of the line beautifully felicitous, the second half a long stumble. But even when the translation is flawlessly eloquent, the nature of the eloquence is often quite different from the biblical original. It comes closest to the biblical style, as I've tried to illustrate at the outset, in the narrative prose. Its treatment of the poetry, on the other hand, owes its eloquent force sometimes to an echoing of the images and the formal configurations of the original, and sometimes, rather more often, to its transformation of the original into a different mode of expression that draws on indigenous English patterns of expression. This amalgam of I'm coming to a conclusion. This amalgam of disparate cultures and styles resulted in a great many sublime passages that have illuminated the inner lives and enchanted the poetic ear of English speakers for 4 centuries. One particularly memorable instance is the 1611 rendering of the anonymous prophet of the Babylonian exile, the sweetest of biblical poets, whose writings are appended to the book of Isaiah. Let me cite just 2 verses, 4 lines of poetry from the beginning of Isaiah 40. After a verse that is one of those left-footed moments involving 2 misconstructions, it runs, "Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem that her warfare is accomplished." There's no warfare at all in the Hebrew. This is how the King James translators make the Hebrew poet sing in English. "The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain." This is sonorous English poetry that lifts the spirit, as truly eloquent language can do. One readily sees how it helped inspire the soaring music of Handel's Messiah, how it and passages like it ignited answering sparks in the celebratory verse of Whitman, Hopkins, Hart Crane. Though the King James Bible may not be altogether what reverential recollection makes of it, after 400 years, its grand language still rings strong. Thank you. And there's no mic out there, but so speak loud.
Sometimes the King James expands the Hebrew. Right. That makes more words. When Moses answered God, he said, "Manaki," which I translate as "who me?" Yeah, right. But the King James makes a whole sentence out of it. And other places where meaning gets lost because they don't translate, such as the word man. Mana. What is it? And how does that affect the meaning as well as the eloquence?
Well, I think your two cases, the first one is the prevalent one. That is where, as in some of the examples that I gave, they just use too many. Well, by the way, a similar example to the one you gave, when Rebecca is, she feels this churning in her womb because the two twins are already so she says, "Why me?" That's the way I translate it. In the Hebrew, "Lama zenochi," and you want to. I don't remember how it's done in the King James Version, but you want to read the next of modern translators who say something like, "Why is this happening to me?" You know, it loses the whole effect. Now, yeah, here and there are. There's a Hebrew word that is simply transliterated, like manna, but that's not a big problem because in the text, in Exodus, they called it manna because people said manhu, which means, what is it? So you could sort of understand it. Then there are a few technical items like the I don't even know how to say it in English, but the Urim and Tumim, the Urim and Thummim, I guess, and the ephod or ephod in the Hebrew. That's all right because one is an oracular device, the other part of the raiment of the high priest, and so it gives it, I think, a little bit of sort of local color to have the technical Hebrew term.
You've been incredibly insightful about the transcendent uses of the KJV, especially in how it captures the lyric quality of the Hebrew original. I wonder if you can speak a little further, as a translator yourself of Hebrew poetry, how you've overcome some of the difficulties, especially in rhythm. And how you overcome what? How you overcome the difficulties in rhythm with Hebrew poetry yourself as a translator. When you're working with Hebrew poetry, how do you overcome the difficulties of rhythm?
You guys, I know a little bit of what you're hearing.
She was just saying how, as a translator, you overcome the divergence in rhythm between the Hebrew and
Okay. I'm sorry about that. My hearing is not quite what it used to be. Sometimes you can't. I mean, my rule of thumb is this: if in order to replicate a Hebrew rhythm, somehow playing fast and loose with the meaning and slightly misrepresenting it I won't allow myself to do it. For example, there's a translator, some of you may know his work, he's translated from a bunch of different languages, Stephen Mitchell, whom I know personally because he lives in the Bay Area. And he did a translation of Job a while ago, which the first time I read it through, this is way before I thought of translating the Bible myself, I said, wow, that's so terrific. It's so fluent and compact. But then when I looked at it again after a few years, I saw that he got that by kind of rearranging and simplifying the Hebrew. So I don't do that, but here's what I do. I leave out words that are not strictly necessary in the Hebrew. I'll give you a kind of mechanical example. Happy is the man, which you get a number of times in Psalms, right? Beginning with the first Psalm. I didn't like the way that sounded in relation to the Hebrew, so I just dropped out the is. Happy the man. And, we can all understand that and read that as poetry. And sometimes you are blessed by the providence that hovers over translators, and you have a real find. I'll give you one example. At the end of Psalm 30, from which I quoted, "What profit in my blood?" There's a line that when the psalmist at the end says that God has restored him from suffering to joy, he says, I'm going to say it in Hebrew first, Hafachta mispedi lemachol li. Now, misped, the first noun, means mourning, and the second noun, machol, means dance. So I looked at that, and I realized that it was really important for the psalmist, because it had two words beginning with an M sound, but by changing what came after the end, he sort of embodied in the sound of the poem God's miraculous transformation from a state of mourning to a state of joy. And then all of a sudden, I thought of the English word dirge. And I said, "You've turned my dirge to a dance for me." And it got the same alliteration. So sometimes you'll luck out, but you can't always do it.
Over there.
Curious about your take on the KJV translators' use.
Could you speak a little louder?
Sure. I'm curious about how the KJV translators dealt with Hebrew names and how you dealt with those as well. Names, particularly, you can play a name that is suggestive of the character of the person. Oh, thank you. I'm curious what you did with Hebrew names. First of all, what the KJV translators did when they approached these names, which so often suggests something of the character of the person, and what you did in your translation.
Well, yeah, you can't, because in my translation, what I've done, I ended up writing a commentary, so I can explain this in a note, which is kind of cheating. But for example, you remember Abigail's nasty husband, this mean old guy who conveniently dies of a heart attack? His name is, in Hebrew, is Naval, I guess Nabal in English pronunciation. And Naval means something like scoundrel or base person. And it gets woven into the dialogue. That is, she says something like, his name is Naval, and he is in fact a Naval. But it sounded to me too weird to name him Scoundrel with a capital S. I thought that looked too funny in English. But by the way, there's another question regarding names. Do you preserve the way they have always been represented in English translations. That is Solomon's son Adonijah, or do you want to say that he's Adoniah, the way he sounds in the Hebrew? And now there are two translators of the Bible, Everett Fox, who's done a couple of books of the Hebrew Bible, and Willis Barnstone. Some of you probably know his translation of the New Testament, who deliberately used the Hebrew forms of all the names. So in Barnstone, Jesus is not Jesus, but Yeshu, and so forth. You can get a little weird with this. that is Barnstone. He's an interesting translator, but for example, he translates. He represents John the Baptist as Yochanan the Dipper. And I thought that was a lapse in good taste. But I guess my sense was this, that English readers for more than 400 years, at least for going back to Tyndale for almost 500 years, have gotten used to these names. And it seemed to me creating an unnecessary element of estrangement not to use the names the way that they've always been represented.
Question.
Okay.
I actually want to make a modest defense of the translators of the King James in Psalm 19. And here's my modest defense for Ohel as tabernacle. Yeah. I think they were actually reflecting a spiritual reading of the text, which comes down through essentially Christian tradition of the Middle Ages. And it'll come to your mind immediately if you think this. Vayikra Moshe Ohel Moed. Yeah, okay. The Lord Moses went into the place of meeting, and there he meets the Lord. And of course, what he's going to meet is he's going to be in the presence of the kavod, the glory of God. This psalm begins, the heavens declare the glory of God. Right. The kavod. Yeah. So what they did was, in the Middle Ages, that they allegorized that. And what this really does is to connect Psalm 19 as an allegory of the sacred presence. So there's a sense in which, for the medieval Catholic tradition, it's kol hakavod when you're reading Psalm 19. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Join me in thanking our very distinguished guests.